Well, this work has been going on at the university for over 50 years, and it was done primarily by Uss Stevenson, who's a psychiatrist. I learned about his work after I had done training and was a child psychiatrist in private practice when I got interested in the question of life after death in general, and learned that his research was going on in the town where I lived, and eventually contacted them just to volunteer to help out with their work, and kind of one thing led to another, and eventually it became my life's work. I continue to see patients, but most of my time now is devoted to the research. So I went to medical school and then did training in psychiatry and child psychiatry. And then, like I said, went into private practice before coming back to the university to do this research. When my wife and I got together, she was much more interested in issues of spirituality and psychic abilities and that sort of thing than I was. And that got me intrigued enough where I started looking into the topic. And that happened to be reading one of Uss Stevenson's books when we saw that they'd started a new project on near-death experiences. So I got into the work not specifically focused on reincarnation, but more just the question of life after death in general. And once I got involved with it, as Uss Stevenson was looking to retire, he wanted someone to carry on the work with past life memories, so that's where I started studying. What I really liked about it was the approach, that it was a very level-headed, objective kind of approach, even though the material was something that isn't often the subject of scientific study, but it was approached in a scientific way. So, you know, with my having my own questions about the possibility of life after death, approaching it in a scientific way rather than a religious way really made sense to me. The work has involved cases of young children who spontaneously start reporting memories of past lives. And what the work has involved is trying to determine as precisely as possible exactly what the child has said about a past life, and then trying to determine how well it fits for somebody who has died. And some children may talk about a past life, but if no one is able to verify that their statements match somebody who actually died, then who's to say it's not just fantasy? But in the strongest cases, the child has talked about someone a great distance away and given a lot of specific details, which then have matched perfectly with somebody who has in fact lived and died. So then it becomes persuasive evidence that there is this connection that the child has to a past life. It's been sort of a slow process for me in the sense that I approach each case with very much an open mind and to some extent a skeptical mind, in the sense that I'm fully aware of any weaknesses or defects in the case and really want to explore those. But over time, I have come across cases that really are pretty much impossible to explain away. So, you know, with those, eventually I've come to feel that we do have good evidence that some children have memories from a past life. There are a couple of American cases that I think are really interesting. Uss Stevenson focused most of his energies on cases in Asia, where it's easiest to find cases in cultures with a belief in reincarnation. But they happen everywhere. And they happen in the United States in families that have had no belief in reincarnation whatsoever. So one of them involves a little boy named James Leininger, who around the time of his second birthday started having horrific nightmares of a plane crash. Night after night, where he would be kicking his legs up in the air, screaming, "Airplane crashed on fire, little man can't get out." And then during the day, he told his parents that he had been a pilot and that his plane had crashed, and said that he flew off of a boat. His parents asked him the name of the boat, and he said Natoma. And he said how he had been shot down by the Japanese, and then later said that he had been killed at Iwo Jima. Well, it turns out that during World War II, there was an aircraft carrier called the Uss Natoma Bay that in fact was involved in the Iwo Jima operation. And it lost one pilot there, one pilot who was shot down by the Japanese. That pilot's plane crashed exactly as James described, how the plane got hit in the engine, burst into flames, crashed in the water, and quickly sank. And James had given all those details that matched. The other thing that matched was that his parents asked him who else was there, and he said Jack Larson. Well, on the day that the pilot's plane crashed, the pilot of the plane next to his was named Jack Larson. So the pilot that was killed was from another part of the country from James, and there was no connection at all. And it was a death from some 60 years before, and yet all the details that James seemed to remember matched this one pilot, the only person that it could have matched, this one pilot from this ship, the USS Natoma Bay. Sometimes the children will go to the place and recognize people or places there. Sometimes they will comment on changes that have happened since the previous life. So they might say, oh, you built a porch on the house or some such thing. In James's case, by the time that people determined who the pilot was, he was getting older. And these kids usually will lose the memories at a fairly early age. His parents did eventually take him to the island near Iwo Jima, where he was killed, and it was quite an emotional experience for them. He didn't exactly come up with new details, but it was quite meaningful to him. It does seem to help for the children to visit the previous place and to meet the previous family. I think for a couple of reasons. One is that it is validating to them that these memories that they've had, that they can see that they were true, that there was this family or there was this place that they've talked about so much. But they also see that people's lives have gone on, that what they are remembering is from the past, and it seems to help them put it in the past more and then get more involved with their current life. In James's case, his father in particular was very opposed to the idea of reincarnation at first. He was a conservative Christian, but by the end he had to conclude that his child had remembered a past life. Now, he remained a Christian, but he incorporated his family's experiences into his religious belief system. And that's certainly what we typically see in the U.S. cases, where most of the families had no belief in reincarnation before their children started making these statements, but then the parents have become persuaded that the child is in fact remembering a past life. And we're not really sure why particular children have memories, whereas most of us don't. And some of it certainly seems to relate to the events in the past life, because over 70% of the lives that the kids are remembering ended with an unnatural death, often violently or through accident or murder, suicide, combat, that sort of thing. So that certainly seems to be a factor. We've done testing on the children, and they don't seem to show any particular psychological attributes, except that they tend to be quite intelligent and quite verbal, and that may help them to voice these, put voice to these images that they're seeing and remembering. So maybe that helps them to have more, to have fuller memories than other children might. Most of the children don't say anything about the time between lives, but about 20% of them do. And some will talk about hanging around the previous family. They may describe the funeral of the previous person. So for instance, there was one little girl who made a lot of statements about the past life, but she also complained that her ashes had been scattered rather than buried the way she wanted them to be. And it turned out with the previous woman, her daughter went to bury her ashes under the tree of the temple complex where she studied the way she wanted them to be. But the root system of the tree was so extensive that she couldn't bury them, so she scattered them instead. And this little girl seemed to have memories of that. And then some of the kids will talk about going to other realms like heaven. The American kids may use the word heaven. And then some will also talk about either choosing their next parents or being guided to their next parents. And some even talk about events that the parents did during the pregnancy, and the kids seem to have knowledge about those. Well, those statements, of course, become very hard to verify. I mean, if a child talks about being in heaven, we can't really, we have to kind of take their word for it. I mean, it's very hard to verify that. But some of the statements that the children have made about things that their parents did, we have been able to verify. So, for instance, James Leininger said that he had chosen his parents, that he had seen them in heaven when they were in Hawaii at a big pink hotel eating dinner on the beach. And it turned out that before he was born, they had in fact taken a trip to Hawaii, stayed at a big pink hotel. The last night they had dinner on the beach, and it was during this trip that they started trying to conceive. They didn't actually get pregnant for another couple of months, but the intention started on that trip, and that was when James said that he saw them doing that he picked them as his parents. Well, we certainly recommend that the parents be open to what their children are saying without necessarily becoming too focused on it, but being open, and when the child feels like talking, then certainly listening to what he or she says. We also let the parents know that this does not seem to be caused by any sort of psychiatric disturbance, and that these memories will typically fade. So even though a 3 or 4-year-old may be distraught frequently about missing the past life, typically by the time they're 6 or 7, these things have faded, and they just go on with their current life. The past life memories tend to fade around the time that all children lose memories of their early childhood. So, if a child has a family friend who they know by name when they're 2 or 3, if that person moves away by the time the child is 6 or 7, most of the time they'll have no memory of that person. And so it sort of makes sense that as the early childhood memories fade, that these would fade along with them. Well, it varies. I mean, there are some families that become close friends, and they may exchange gifts. The child may go spend time with the previous family. Typically, the child's family doesn't necessarily want to have too much of a connection with the previous one. They're concerned that the child may stay too emotionally attached to the previous family rather than the current one. So it really varies, and I mean, there are some families where they never even meet. But typically, even the ones that are exchanging visits early on, that will usually fade after a few years, and people just go on with their lives. Usually the emotions that the kids show in these cases will fade along with their statements, but there are exceptions, and there's at least one case where the boy eventually grew up to marry the widow of the previous person. Well, that was one of Ian Stevenson's cases, and frankly, I don't know a lot of the details, or don't remember a lot of the details, but when he met them, he met a married couple, and they explained that the way they had met each other was that the boy had remembered the past life as the husband of this woman, and they had made a connection that way, and eventually when he grew up, they got married. Ian was the first one that really devoted a huge amount of time and effort to it and turned it into an area of scientific research. And he never went into a lot of detail about why he did that. To some extent, some of the reasons I think were personal, but also some of it was just sort of happenstance. He wrote a paper about some of the cases that he had read about, and that paper led people to get interested in it and actually to offer to start funding him to study them. And so he just got more and more involved in the work, and then spent 40 years studying the cases. Well, I've been involved for about 15 years or so. Well, altogether we've studied over 2,500. And not just the two of us, there have been several other researchers involved too. But I mean, this research has been going on now for over 50 years, and we've got a lot of cases from pretty much all over the world. Most people view science and spirituality as being separate, and the idea of doing the work or funding the work of the scientific study of spirituality is something that a lot of people are not very excited about. A lot of universities are not very excited about. But there are a number of us who have been able to devote time to this work, and it's serious-minded work, so it has earned some respect, even though it hasn't caught on where there are a whole lot of people doing it. Well, I don't see why there can't be, and I think there is much more so than there used to be. I mean, in medical schools, at least in the U.S., there's certainly more emphasis on respecting the spirituality of patients, and that was something that was not present 20 or 30 years ago. So people are also aware that spirituality can make a difference in health, and that people who have a strong belief and have faith and hope tend to do better if they have a medical illness than someone who's depressed and hopeless. I think that's hard to say. I mean, the hope obviously always is that the next generation can learn from the previous one and then take it to the next step. I think with the children now, there are obviously challenges in the modern world that were not present before, but there are also opportunities. And certainly as far as information goes, people have access to more information on their little handheld smartphone than people used to have their whole lives. So certainly there are opportunities for children's minds to expand in a way that was not present 100 or 200 years ago. Well, I don't really know what the future holds. I think it's possible that there will continue to be more and more respect for the idea of mind being considered separate from the physical, that there is this realm of consciousness or mind or creativity that certainly interacts with the physical world, but is also independent of it, and that obviously feeds into spirituality, not necessarily all religions per se, but into the idea that there is more than just this physical world. Well, I'm not sure how much the world would change even if reincarnation were proved. I mean, there has certainly been places where reincarnation was an accepted fact by most of the people. And there have certainly been times in the past where essentially everyone believed in God and heaven and hell and all that. But it didn't necessarily mean that everyone was a good person. And it takes more than, I think, knowledge of something, even knowledge of reincarnation. That there's also sort of the emotional, psychological side to it, where knowledge can be part of growth, but it takes more than that for people to really grow and develop as an individual. With my research, I am certainly open to the possibility of reincarnation. And I think our cases do provide good evidence that some young children have memories that come from a life in the past. Now, the most obvious explanation is that they lived that past life and now they remember it. But that's really not the only explanation, and there could certainly be some sort of psychic effect that would not mean they had literally lived a past life. So I don't say that I'm a believer in reincarnation because even if you accept our cases, I'm not at all convinced that it's universal, that everyone reincarnates. I think our cases offer good evidence that there's this part of us, this consciousness part, that can survive after death, but they don't necessarily mean that it then reincarnates in a new life. Near-death experiences are also an example where there's evidence that people, at least being very close to death or being physiologically in the dying process can continue to have experiences, that their minds continue to function even though their brains are not. Well, then it's also evidence that consciousness is not completely dependent on the physical brain. And there are certainly examples of near-death experiences where, by all accounts, the brain was not functioning at all, and yet people were having very rich experiences that included a spiritual component. Well, certainly, and as a child psychiatrist, obviously, I see a lot of children where they are having behavioral issues, and with some of them, the medications do help, but we also try to address the bigger picture. And certainly in modern life, there are a lot of stressors on families and on children, and children tend to respond to stress. Many of them respond by having behavioral difficulties. So certainly a pill is not going to fix the environmental stressors. But parents, for the most part, do the best they can, and for some of them, they want a medicine that'll really help, but that often, I think, shows just how much stress that the parents are under. No, and most of us do not have memories of past lives. I mean, it certainly seems to be uncommon, so I can't really say if I've had one before, but maybe I'll find out one day between lives. Well, we focus on children almost exclusively because they are the ones who spontaneously have memories of a past life. We don't do the hypnotic regression work, and in fact we're a little skeptical that what people recall during that are actual memories of a past life. Hypnosis can be kind of a tricky tool even for memories of this life. Now, the experience may be quite therapeutic to people, but that doesn't mean they're actually recalling past lives. Well, there's a little boy in the U.S. named Ryan, and he started talking about missing his life in Hollywood. And he would cry to his mom every day about missing his life in Hollywood. So she eventually went and got some books out of the library about Hollywood to see if looking at the pictures could sort of help him process this better. They got to a picture of a scene from an old movie, and he pointed to one of the men in the picture and said, "Hey, that's George, we did a film together," and then pointed to another one and said, "Oh, and hey, that's me, I found me." Well, the first guy he pointed to was George Raft, who was an American movie star. But the second one he pointed to was an extra who had no lines in the movie. So Mom wrote to me to see if I could help identify who this fellow was. And as we were trying to determine that, she was emailing me sometimes on a daily basis with the statements that Ryan was making, and he was describing quite a life. He said how he had danced on Broadway, and then he'd gone to Hollywood, he had worked in the movies, then he had worked for an agency, he went on big boats to see the world, and how he had a big house with a swimming pool. All of this seemed quite unlikely to me for an extra with no lines in a movie. But it turned out the fellow he had pointed to was a guy named Marty Martin, who in fact had that life. He had danced on Broadway. He had gone to Hollywood, where he worked in the movies, not just as an extra, but also worked on dancing in movies. Then he started a very successful talent agency. He and his wife went to Europe on the Queen Mary, and he did have a big house with a swimming pool, and Ryan had said that the street address had the word Rock or Mount in it, and Marty Martin lived on Roxbury. And he had died in the early 1960s, so that was another case where a young child seemed to have very specific details from someone who had lived and died decades before, and there seemed to be no way that he could have known about that.